One. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's our pleasure to welcome you to a very special webinar today. We will discuss Uncarbon, the strategies to achieve net zero with tech and natural-based solutions. So literally a bit of the future of sustainability for you in a 60 minutes discussion. I immediately want to introduce you our special panelist, many friends, many great experts in sustainability. And I will introduce them alphabetically, if you allow me. I will start from Alexia. So say, welcome, Alexia. She's the Managing Director of Carbon Policy and Markets Initiative at the iTide Foundation. She serves on the board of the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Markets, as well as on the Advanced and Indirect Mitigation Initiative. Previously, she has a lot of experience in our field. She has been director of Net Zero plus Nature at Netflix, leading their carbon reduction strategy, and also director of sustainability solution at ENGIE Impact, advising on net zero decarbonization strategy for several Fortune 500 companies and non-profits organizations. We're proud to have you with us, Alexia. Second, I'm very glad to have with us my friend Harper McConnell. She's the Global Vice President of Cocoa Sustainability at Mars, the leading food industry player, where she leads a sustainable sourcing strategy to achieve Mars financial, climate, and social goals. Altogether, this means guiding over $1 billion in sustainability investment through 2030. Not believable. Prior to Mars, Harper was the Global Director of Coffee and Cocoa Sustainability at Starbucks, leading the company's sustainability commitments in these commodities and the supply chain. Her team famously was responsible for building the fast digital coffee training program for over 300,000 employees globally. So I'm very happy later to ask her how she can literally bridge the technical needs of working on the sourcing strategies to the outreach to so many thousands and thousands of employees that need to understand fast why sustainability matters. I want to give you a fun fact. She's fluent in Swahili, having spent over 10 years in Africa. Good morning, Harper. Glad to have you with us. To continue, I'm happy to have you with us. Yauven Ma is the principal of climate and the principal in climate strategy lead at Apollo Global Management, the largest American alternative asset manager. She is responsible for advising and supporting the firm's climate, physical risk and transition, as well as facilitating the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. Overseeing the decarbonization and carbon neutral operations, including the management of Apollo renewable energy certificates and carbon removal portfolios. So a lot of topics for our discussion today. Welcome again, Yauven. I want to say last but not least, we have Dr. May Boy, the Director of Climate Science at Supercritical, world leader in carbon removal markets and the patrons of today's discussion. She leads the vetting of carbon dioxide removal projects that sells credits on the supercritical marketplace. She also serves on the advisory board of PureHeart, the famous crediting platform for engineered carbon markets. In this role, she contributes to the methodologies for monitoring, reporting, verifications of so many carbon projects. She is also a member of the Scientific Advisory Group for the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and previously she worked on the Industrial Decarbonization Challenge, the 200+ million program of the UK Research and Innovation Public Body. Again, big welcome to you, Mai. With this beautiful panel, I just add a couple of words about myself. I'm Andrea. I'm the founder of Illuminen. I am teaching green tech at HEC Paris, the University of Paris, and I'm truly honored to moderate today's discussion and try to bring to light a bit of the secret to make a real net zero strategy in our companies. And I would say, let's immediately enjoy this discussion. And I want to start exactly with you, Mai. The first question is intentionally broad. I want to ask you the role of nature-based solutions and tech-based solutions, respectively, in a good net zero strategy.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. I guess the key difference between the two streams is what we call permanence, or the durability of the carbon storage. And so when you're developing your net zero strategy, right now we're very much focused on the carbon removal side. The issue with nature-based solutions is it's quite broad. It covers not just removal projects, which are mainly afforestation, but it also has a lot of projects that prevent deforestation, which is more an avoidance credit, or other approaches that do emission reduction, which are distinctively different to carbon removals. So often with a lot of buyers, it can be quite confusing coming into a nature-based solution pathway because you're not quite sure which project is which. On our side, we're focused on carbon removal. So the things that we sell, for instance, are focused on afforestation projects like community agroforestry or native reforestation. These provide a lot of co-benefits alongside the removal side. It also provides biodiversity improvements. So that's where they're focusing on planting native species, also avoiding invasive species, and then also social impacts where they're engaged with the communities. For the projects we're involved with, we're looking for revenue sharing with the communities themselves, so direct social impacts. And often the challenge is really the carbon removal side, where how long is that carbon stored for? So we're also checking, for instance, that they've got the contracts in place to demonstrate that those trees are protected to provide the contracted permanence level, which might be 30 years or 60 years. These are things that we check on our due diligence checks and through our vetting process. On the technology-based solution side, this is very much a broad spectrum or portfolio of options. You've got things like direct air capture, super high costs, but much easier to do MRV because you can just measure CO2, and the pipeline is something that you can put sort of sensors on and flow meters on, so it's much easier to do MRV. But they are high permanence. It is higher cost. Then you've got sort of like the middle of the ground technologies, which might be BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or biochar, which have like medium pricing, and also still permanent options, but much more lower in cost. But then they also face challenges on sort of demonstrating the sustainability of the feedstock that they're using. So the biomass has to be sustainable. And then sort of like new upcoming emerging technologies is also a feature here in the technology-based solution approach, where buyers are unsure about these new approaches like biomass burial or, sort of carbonation approaches or direct ocean capture technologies. They have a lot of promise, but then require a lot of work in terms of checking to see that, you're protected on the delivery risk side of things. So that's where a lot of due diligence checks might be done by various entities to just make sure that these projects can deliver on the sort of promised timescales. So that's where, when you're developing your net zero strategy, you're really trying to diversify across these different risk factors around delivery risk, permanence risk, and then trying to build a sort of robust net zero strategy that kind of factors in all these different things. And cost is obviously a key factor for a lot of buyers as well. So that's really, I guess, the overall strategy there for net zero that customers will have to think about.
Already a lot of material on the plate for our deep dives and future discussions. Maybe I want to immediately move from the perspective of a company that is helping the entire ecosystem, like Supercritical, to the perspective of the company that is literally creating a net zero plan in its daily operations. And I want to start with you, Harper. Can you maybe walk us through the fundamentals of your net zero roadmap? Which consideration guide your choices of all the solutions that Mai just discussed?
Yeah, certainly. So obviously we as Mars, look at scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So look at first our own house per se, and then recognize that there's going to be a degree of areas where we might have to buy an offset later. So just as a a reminder, we have Mars snacking, there's Mars pet care, there's Mars food. And so what we've done, and we've made it public, so I really encourage you all to go look at it online, because we've made all of the costing and the calculations and everything public across the board. So what we did was baseline all of our emissions in 2015. And we said by 2030, we need to be at 50% of our 2015 baseline while we grow the business, right? So we're not skirting around and also saying, okay, well, it's equal to this or this, but it's saying we expect significant growth year over year, just like every other business, but we expect the curve to continue to come down year over year. And so we costed out and predicted that basically in 2022, we are at 92% of our baseline. We'll have our 2024 numbers out soon as well. But we're confident that we can get to really around 50% of our baseline in 2030. But we recognize that really that 2030 to 2050 to get that extra, like it's 30% or so that we know we're going to have to offset, it just gets harder and harder. So let me just talk through quickly how we're doing it in both our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So the vast majority of our emissions, and many other CPG companies or retail companies like ourselves who sell any type of food, come from scope 3. So come from where the cocoa is grown, where palm is grown, where sugar, where dairy, etc. And so we have to work with suppliers to reduce those emissions. Then as we look at logistics and retail, those start to make up really that other 40%, packaging, operations, co-manufacturing, but really the big chunk is in scope 3 emissions. And I think I saw a cartoon, I think on the other day, where it was like, oh, scope 1 emissions. Okay, I know how to address this. I transitioned to 100% renewable energy in my factories and my co-mans, and I tweak my logistics and get it right here. And it's so true. And then in the cartoon, like, has the mind blown when it comes to scope 3 emissions. And it's really, really the truth. It's, scope 1, you got to do it. It's clear what you have to do, and it's within your own power and your own control. And so we've really done that at Mars, is transition how we power our factories, our office, our veterinary hospitals, and address energy that's used by the farmers. But when it comes to scope 3, we have to look at a few different areas, which I'll maybe go into a little bit later. But just broadly, as Maya said, we have to stop deforestation. So there was deforestation in our supply chains, and that is the biggest lever to pull to ensure you're deforestation free. 2, we got to scale up our initiatives in climate smart agriculture. So that deals with regenerative agriculture, biochar, optimizing sourcing, switching to more renewable ingredients, and optimizing our recipes as well. So developing new lower GHG footprint ingredients, and across the board, but it takes time, and we're making significant progress, but it's going to also take significant progress from now to 2030 to really reach that negative 50%. While meeting our business growth expectations. But I think the great news is that we're not the only ones trying to solve this problem alone, and we have a lot of suppliers and peers who are committed to doing it as well.
Wow, so many so many elements, and I love the picture of the cartoon. I was actually using it myself in explaining the complexity of the challenges we discussed there. I want to stay exactly on this tone, and I now go to you, Alexia, and you actually have seen so many companies in implementing the strategies and facing the challenges of scope 3 and using nature-based solution and using tech-based solutions. So maybe I want to ask you, in your companies, in your experience, how did you balance the immediacy, is a typical advantage of nature-based solution, with the scalability of the tech-based solution in your strategy?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the invitation to join you here. Great discussion so far. There's a lot to unpack when you're thinking about how you design a science-based net zero strategy for a company, and I think broadly for the space. And it's only really in the last 5 years that we've become obsessed with carbon removal. Carbon removal is very important. It is one part of the puzzle. And as Harper was just saying, a lot of the challenge, particularly in the next decade, is going to be about how do we decouple and reduce our emissions intensity of all of our activities? And how do we really start leaning into taking advantage of the things that are most cost effective and immediately available from a mitigation perspective, because we are in fact in a climate emergency. So in my view, a net zero strategy that does not preference and give weight to the opportunities that avoided emissions present, and that helping us put in place those efficiency measures that are going to enable companies to grow with significantly fewer fossil fuel-based inputs is going to be critically important. On the treatment of removals, I think in the tech versus kind of nature, we've really gotten into this, what I think is a pretty unfortunate and false dichotomy between permanent technology-based CDR and nature-based CDR. And there is zero question, if you ask any scientist in the world, that we need it all. We are in a climate emergency. We need to maximize the mitigation that we can deliver at the lowest cost and as quickly as possible, which I think actually would lead us to a slightly different policy design than the one that we are working with right now, which sort of takes where we think the atmosphere needs to be in 2050, which is we've delivered all of the emission reductions that are available down to 80% in the global economy, and we just have that 10% residual left to deal with. That is not where we are today. And a lot of the conversation sort of skips right ahead and says, okay, well, we're just going to assume that all of those avoided emissions and all of that efficiency and all of those emission reductions are going to magically appear. And we just need to focus on scaling the technology-based CDR. And I think everyone knows that that is actually not going to get us where we need to be, particularly not on the timelines. And so a lot of the work that we're doing at the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets right now is really about how do we design a policy system that is going to enable us to solve for the balance of geophysical requirements of durable carbon storage in systems, right? Whether they be a CDR system with underground storage or a forest. The legal aspect, and this is something that we don't talk about a lot, but actually becomes very important, because even if you have a permanent CDR technology like direct air capture that is sequestering the CO2 permanently underground, you still have to have legal constructs that have somebody on the hook for making sure that that emission remains sequestered, or some sort of monitoring technology. And so a lot of the conversation we're having right now is really about who is bearing, as May said, the risk of reversal. How is that risk allocated? How is that risk monitored? And how do we address that risk so that the atmosphere remains whole in the event that a reversal occurs? Because we know reversals are going to occur. It's inevitable, right? Like, we live in the real world and stuff happens. And so the system that we're working to design right now is really taking that combination of geophysical and scientific, legal, and cultural aspects of permanence requirements. So who's on the hook for how long to make sure that the carbon stays, and building those systems in a way that actually works while keeping the atmosphere whole. So the continuous improvement work program that I co-chair along with my colleague Pedro Martins Barata from EDF really are looking at and unpacking the core options for the way in which the voluntary carbon market in particular has addressed permanence so far, how well that's working, whether it's working, and ways in which we can potentially improve it to ensure that we can have a more tech agnostic approach. And my favorite carbon removal tech is still a tree. Been removing carbon from the atmosphere for millennia very effectively. It is one of the only cost-effective scalable solutions we have available to us today. And so designing a system that's going to enable us to take a more tech agnostic approach while still delivering the atmospheric impact that's required at cost that companies can actually bear is going to be sort of the holy grail of sorting this question out over the next 2 decades. So I'm looking forward to digging in more, but I'll pause there for now.
I love already that, Alexia, you rightly pointed us at understanding the risk to really build this strategy and make it effective, and also never dismissing all the solutions that often have a lot to teach us even today. Jovan, now I come to you. You might have asked where we need a bit more of inclusivity in this panel. Otherwise, only power ladies are speaking. But jokes aside, that's also sustainability. One of the rare fields where literally the gender balance speaks for itself. Now, I want to start with a provocation. You lead climate strategy at Apollo. We all know Apollo. We all know that Apollo is active in many high emission sectors that pose many challenges and, of course, have many solutions to unlock. Here, I want to ask you, how do you leverage tech-based solution to enhance the carbon removal durability? How do you assess the climate risk that Alexia just talked about, and how do you actually ultimately align all of these to the TCFD goals that you work on? So to you, Jovan, and again, welcome to be with us.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea, and also glad to be here, and thank you again for having us here as well. I think it's a very big question, so let me try to unpack it and also provide some context as well around Apollo. I know many often don't always understand the business that we operate in, and then I'll also dive into the approach as well in terms of how we use carbon removals currently. So to provide some context, Apollo is an alternative asset manager and retirement solutions provider. We deliver a variety of investment solutions at every point of the risk-reward spectrum, covering investment-grade private credit all the way to private equity. And the firm at the most senior level views portfolio allocation as with a longer-term horizon, benefiting both the exposure of public market investments as well as increasingly private market investments. Both can be risky as well as safe, depending on the structure as well as the type of investments that's within different funds. When we think about our integrated investment platform, sustainability is understood to be a driver of opportunity and growth. And so I sit in our central sustainability office. My role is focused on partnering with colleagues across the corporate business team, across the credit and equity strategies, to really think about and deliver climate sustainability and transition management capabilities. And we think about the beneficiaries as three different levels, right? There's APO, our shareholders, or a publicly listed entity. There's funds and our investors and fund LPs. And then there's the investment positions within the funds with equity, its portfolio companies, with private credit, its underlying invested entities. Now, when we think about engaging with high emission sectors, there are three different ways we think about it. So the first way we think about it is in our core investment business. We look for opportunities to finance a transition towards a potential net zero economy. And we have what we call a climate and transition investment framework. And so from a TCFD perspective, our opportunity is really around capital deployment. We have a target of 50 billion by 2027 in terms of investing towards climate and transition solutions. And we see the potential for that to grow up to 100 billion by 2030. So financing the transition is our #1 priority as an alternative asset manager and retirement solutions provider. Now, there are some instances where we have stronger operational influence, and our equity strategies are primarily where we would see that opportunity. And so we do have certain funds where we do have fund mandates with consensus across LPs to have emission intensity reduction targets. And those targets would apply equally to the high emission sectors as well, such as airlines, manufacturing industries, and other types of sectors where we engage on topics such as sustainable aviation fuels. For the topic today, carbon removals, it best fits in the third bucket. And that third bucket really applies to our own corporate business activities and our office environments globally. So when we think about our corporate offices, we do procure a portfolio of carbon removal solutions currently alongside the use of renewable power. And it's really around removing the residual operational emissions from our offices on an annually recurring basis. And we do use a mix of both nature-based solutions, technology-based solutions. Be happy to dive into more around the thought process behind that. Durability is a very important topic that came up earlier, and that is a very important criteria for us. But there are also other criteria that we really zero in and emphasize as well. And accounting is a big one that's first and foremost. So does the underlying project have conservative accounting estimations, have buffer pools held, where there's an element of risk management associated with the delivery of the credits that we believe we're receiving? Then there's third-party verification. So third-party verification, not just in the project documentation when listing in a registry, but also some type of annual or other frequency of verification on the project outcomes. So again, we are reassured that the delivery of the credits is what it says it is in the project documents. And the third is really around regional specificity. When you look at our corporate offices, 80% of it, just over 80%, is really US centric in terms of where our employees are based out of. And then if you include India, the UK, and Europe, that's over 95% of our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions where we apply carbon removal solutions. So we do have to look for projects, and this is often a criteria where we end up screening out a number of considerations. We do have to look for projects that are regionally specific to where we believe the emissions are being released. And so we can continue to stay pragmatic around maximizing what we believe the impact is when we make procurements for carbon removals.
Thank you, Jovan. I understand even more the complexity of your job, and thank you for having shared all of this with us. In the meantime, I want to remember all our attendees today. We are around 100 people already live here, so you can ask questions. We're going to go back to your questions in the last 15 minutes of this webinar. So already feel free to share your ideas, your questions to our speakers. And now let me continue, not only looking at the risk, not only looking at the complexities of this profession, but at the opportunities. And I want to start the second round with you, Harper. I want to understand what is your approach to reducing value chain emissions. In your case, you cover cocoa affairs, but I'm sure you have a broader experience and overview. I want to ask you, where do you see the most promising opportunity?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the largest culprit. So we source a lot of cocoa, right? And majority of that cocoa comes from Ghana and Ivory Coast, also across the Americas as well. And some of those areas were heavily deforested, right, in the early 2000s. And so the first step is, right, stem the bleeding and make sure that, number one, that we're sourcing from cocoa that's fields that have been deforestation free since 2014. Now, even though that field is deforested in 2014, for example, those emissions still live within our supply chain, right, until they're linearly discounted over a longer period of time. So in 2025, we'll be nearly fully deforestation free within our cocoa supply chain, likewise within palm. And we do rely on third-party verifiers to share the data with us, to have hundreds of thousands of polygon maps that we use to monitor and look at the areas that we're sourcing from. So I think the takeaway here is again, as I remind our team and our executives, it's not just because you reach a deforestation free one year that the next year it's automatically guaranteed, right? Supply chains are incredibly dynamic, and that's what the thing the team is talking to, as you look at both permanence across the board, whether that's for removals. So good news is that we're on track there. Next is really looking at agriculture emissions, right? So all of the emissions that come from whether you're applying fertilizer, whether or not you're applying agroforestry. So we've planted about over 5 million trees on cocoa farms. And then again, to speak to the complexity, we've planted all these trees. We actually haven't accounted for it in our supply chain. So we've done a good deed, but now we're in also the process of figuring out that risk model. How do we incorporate the permanence within it? How do we ensure that we're also being conservative into accounting in that regard as well? So we are investing in agroforestry across all the regions that we're sourcing from. Second is agriculture emissions. So you have kind of two sides of productivity. We really want high productive farms because of two reasons. One, it lowers carbon emissions ostensibly if you're looking at 1 hectare of land and you have more cocoa coming from that area. And two, it increases the income for the farmer. But the how you make it productive is really important, because if you just make it productive through dumping nitrogen fertilizer on it, well, then you've increased your emissions. And so now we're really at the exciting time period. And I think there's a lot of innovation unlocks around green fertilizer, but how do we actually get these technologies distributed and, most important, affordable for people to use them in a way that really makes sense for their own farm profitability? How do we evaluate other areas like biochar? How do we make that affordable and that production readily available? And so those are the exciting areas that our team is working on, and where I think there is a significant amount of business opportunity, whether that's for startups or for suppliers of larger companies as well, to figure out how do we unlock this model in a way that we can really capture, and we ensure that it is reducing our own footprint, but that it's doing it in an affordable way. Because we also can't just, increase our cost of goods by 40% every year, because the consumer ultimately won't pay for that, right? And so I think, lastly, we really think end to end. We can't separate climate, from people. It's impossible to separate the land from the people who live on it and farm on it. And so as we look at cocoa and in other crops, it's super important for us, again, to ensure that we can have farmers in our supply chain that can reach max productivity. And that means not just through fertilizer, but through having the best planting material, et cetera, that isn't necessarily readily available. So we're working significantly throughout the countries, both with the governments, the suppliers that we work on, to see how can we ensure that what we're doing is, in the best interest of the farmer, and that the farmer ultimately is benefiting from it. Because if the farmer is not incentivized to do the things that will reduce the footprint, then we can't expect someone to change their behavior if the incentive structure is not pointing them to them in that way. So our team has some super exciting, I think, innovative problems to solve. And we just had our team offsite today, and we always remind each other, what we're doing feels hard, because it is hard. We're trying to solve poverty. We're trying to solve, climate. And but it's also incredibly exciting at the same time for where we're at in the position that we're in.
Let me say, Harper, congratulations for the results that you're bringing. I want to use the last two words that you used. Number one, you need to unlock solutions. The other one is you need to ensure the affordability, right? You cannot make it in a very expensive way, because when it's too expensive at some point, it's not long lasting. I then bring these two observations to you, Mai, and I want to ask you, which advices would you give to corporate buyers, to our corporate leaders here, trying to build a budget, so something that is unconstrained, that accounts for both these tech solutions, typically higher cost, and nature-based solutions, like the three that Alexia mentioned?
That's a great point. And I guess if you think about the ultimate goal of why we're doing all of this, it's essentially, the 1.5 degree target, or, the Paris Agreement. The key issue is that we just don't have enough, CO2 removals. And I echo Harper's point, Alexia's point about, first and foremost, reducing emissions is a key priority, because essentially to get net zero, you need to reduce your emissions as much as possible. But we still need the CO2 removal piece. And the problem is that if we don't start today, we won't build up that scale ready for the future. And more or less what you're trying to do potentially is just trying to maximize impact, right? Things that require scaling will require that investment early on. And so there's a sort of obsession right now about doing net zero. So they quantify the CDR. They have very constrained budgets. And essentially that really limits your options of what CDR approaches you can do. And it's typically, well, we've set a floor price of $50 per ton, you're really just limited to nature-based solutions. But if you set a higher price, potentially 100, you could potentially do a bit more impact here, where you can do a blended approach, where you think about what combination you could do a bit of the expensive things to catalyze these, more permanent options, tech-based options, which tend to be more expensive, and then also blend in a few of the nature-based solutions, which still also have a lot of impact, because you can have social benefits as well as the biodiversity benefits. And so that blended approach could be one way. Another aspect, which is thinking about your future net zero strategy as an industry. So for instance, the aviation sector, they have sustainable aviation fuel as part of their strategy. So investing in direct air capture makes sense, because it's then supplying and building a technology that can also go into another net zero strategy that they have in their whole industrial plan. And things like in the building sector, construction sector, things like mineralization processes that produce more sustainable aggregates that can then result in more lower carbon footprint buildings and cement. And so think about your business as well, and where your strategy lies on net zero of the carbon reduction side, and maybe there's synergies with certain CO2 removal pathways, that by investing in that CO2 removal, you also enable the carbon reduction. So that's another aspect. And so it's not always just about reaching net zero today, but thinking about the overall massive impact you could make with your investment and where that lies in terms of your overall strategy as an industry. So that's some comments that can I think about, I guess, for buyers to think about when they're doing net zero.
Thank you, Mai. I literally want to follow exactly on this point and take the angle of Alexia. Alexia before gave us a very symbolic answer, said the oldest of all solution for me is still the best one. I like that trick, right? So now that we understood from Mai, like the importance of accounting for both solution in your budgets, understanding the cost constraint, but also like the durability of your outcome. So I want to ask you, you believe in science, you believe in SBTi guidance. So why you, Alexia, still believe that companies should invest in nature-based solutions together with tech solutions? Given that, to give a premise, of course, that SBTi don't recognize the NDS in the net zero target. That's of course.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you've heard me speak before, you'll know that I actually think that SBTi landed in the wrong place on the design of their net zero target. I was on the net zero EAG and the expert advisory group in 2019, whenever that was, that it was being developed. And we had a lot of very heated debates about what is the right kind of combination of things that companies should be incentivized to do on their journey to net zero and at the point of net zero. And I think this is still very much a live conversation that's happening out there in the world. Personally, I believe that there is a way to design net zero policy that accommodates the full range of investments that we're going to need between now and 2030, 2035, 2040, that the IPCC is abundantly clear we do not get to 1.5 degrees without. So we want to keep companies doing the hard and expensive and laborious work of engaging their supply chains and implementing the emission reductions in those supply chains and investing in the sustainable aviation fuels and transforming the way in which they do business. That all needs to happen. We also need to be simultaneously, as May says, investing in those early stage carbon removal technologies so that they can get to scale when we need them to be operating at scale in 2040, 2050. That also can't wait. And finally, we need to be investing in nature because nature is the thing that we need to survive on this planet. It is not an optional part of the climate solution, and we do not get where we need to be without sustained and scaled investment in both protection, conservation, and restoration of natural systems globally. All of those things can and should be incentivized in well-designed net zero policy. I believe that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. It is possible. But just like any good investment strategy from a company perspective, you want a diversified approach. So the way in which we managed our costs in my previous role was really looking at the blended cost across our entire portfolio of investment options and strategies that we were looking at. That included blending in things like very low cost, high integrity reduction credits from methane destruction, for example, the emergency brake for climate change that we have, and some of the most cost-effective, lowest cost abatement that we have available that is also permanent, imminently measurable, and very high integrity. In fact, methane destruction was one of the first carbon credit types to earn a CCP label by the ICBCM. So by taking that portfolio approach where you're including methane, which is pennies on the dollar, there's very high quality methane abatement available for under $5 a ton, if you can believe it, all the way through to reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation at scale, and carbon removal, both nature and tech-based. You can get to an average blended price that is reasonable from a company perspective as we're thinking about a multi-decadal approach to decarbonization, both within corporate supply chains and globally. The last thing I'll say that I think companies will increasingly start doing is looking at opportunities to invest directly in carbon removal technology systems and companies off their balance sheets. So there's a bunch of other money that companies can play with that aren't necessarily tied only to their sustainability budget, that they're really just starting to think about how they can potentially deploy. And if I was still in a corporate sustainability role, that is certainly the place where I would be looking, is to take ownership positions in some of these companies and technologies so that as they start to get to scale, I have the right to count the emission reductions in my broader portfolio. We have some greenhouse gas accounting rules to sort out on that. So as Harper mentioned, there's not clear guidance right now on how you account for mitigation implementation within your supply chain in good ways. That's a big role of the advanced and indirect mitigation platform. So we need to get those rules sorted out. But I expect a huge amount of movement on that in the next, even just 5 years, as the rules become clearer, that will unleash what we hope will be billions of dollars of additional investment across the board.
We feel the movement indeed. Jovan, now I come back to you, and with the shakes that we all are feeling, right? With the ecosystem that is changing, I want to start by telling with the economic constraint arriving around many climate strategies. We know is probably a new era with a change of the presidency in your country. I want to ask, how does Apollo build the business case for investing in NBS and TBS? So how can you ensure that your stakeholders, your portfolio companies, as well as your investors, understand the nuances of this strategy and find it right to continue and even go bolder in these NBS and TBS investments?
Yeah, thank you. And can I just say, I'm really appreciating the commentary here across the panel as well in terms of the subject matter that we're diving into and the nuance already around some of the approaches with CDR. I think for us at Apollo, the business case, when we think about both nature-based solutions and engineered removals, it very much does come down to the size of the investments and whether it makes sense in the context of the alternative options and the problem that we're trying to solve for. And so with our climate and transition investment framework, those investments need to make economic sense for our LPs and meet our fund-specific risk-reward mandates for whatever the type of equity or credit structure is. And also there's a minimum investment size threshold in terms of whether it makes sense from an equity or credit perspective. So the taxonomy does specifically call out nature-based solutions and engineered removals, but we don't often see it come through the pipeline yet in terms of being a climate and transition investment, even with the existing capital deployed. Having said that, in our corporate business activities where carbon removal is currently used, we do take a cost-conscious approach to ensuring that there is measurable, reportable, and verifiable emissions removed. And we have found most success with our nature-based solutions in terms of being able to meet the near-term requirements of our most recent calendar year operating emissions for Scope 1 and Scope 2. Engineered removals, typically, as Mai mentioned as well, there's a minimum threshold of at least $100 per ton, if not higher, often going up to $1,000 per ton. And so we have exposure there. It's a budget allocation that's further out into the future. We do view it as upfront spend for more diverse access to different methodologies that we are anticipating demand for in the future. And also to support the growth of industries and solutions that we believe are necessary as part of transitioning towards a net zero economy. And when we think of our operating activities and when we refer to residual emissions and carbon neutral operations, even though it is primarily Scope 1 and Scope 2 for the time being, we do engage with a third-party vendor to think through energy efficiency and decarbonization of both our leased and owned office spaces to ensure that there are indeed no positive ROI decarbonization options out there with a payback of less than 8 or 10 years, roughly speaking, before we then proceed with the procurement of carbon removals. And so that cost is additional to our ongoing business operations. And it makes sense for us because one, we're looking to act in a similar way to how we advise our equity portfolio companies when it comes to the decarbonization strategy and approach. And also two is it's acknowledging that there may be a longer term role here for nascent innovative technology solutions as we head towards the path of a net zero economy and making that a reality. And we do also view commercial office spaces. Every industry, every firm has substantial or some level of office space in terms of housing their employees. And that is something you can more readily solve for, including carbon removals, even if it's a smaller quantity in the near term, as we continue to solve for the medium and longer term challenges around a business transition plan and around transition strategies.
Like it. Thank you, Jovan, for sharing the graduality of your focus on TBS and all the, let's say, all the need of balancing probably was a key word that I want to retain from your intervention. I want to start taking the first question from our audience, so feel free to continue writing your questions here in the chat. We already received 7 of them, and I want to start with a question coming from Switzerland, and in this case goes to you, Yauven, and the question is, we know that carbon is a global discussion. It's something that you might say levels out globally. So why is regional specificity so important as a criteria for a purchaser of CDR?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because climate change absolutely is global in terms of the science of the impact of frequency and severity of natural catastrophes. And for us, it really comes down to how we use the carbon removals in terms of making claims around neutralizing or removing the estimated emissions we're releasing, particularly for Scope 1. In our offices, we really want to ensure, at a minimum, from an emissions accounting perspective, the projects that we select has taken a conservative approach, obviously, in terms of the accounting. So it's not assuming aggressive deforestation when that in reality is not the likely outcome if the carbon project was not executed, and that there's a reasonable amount of buffer in place. Part of that conservatism also means that we want to ensure, ideally, if we're releasing the emissions in a specific region in the US, it's extremely hard for us to pinpoint that removal in that particular municipality or state, but to be able to try and at least preserve the rough country or geography of where the emissions is being balanced helps to, again, strengthen some of the guidelines we're using as we think about the impacts of our emissions being released, as well as the impacts negated, hopefully through the support of removal solutions in the way that we intended to be used beyond the claims and labels we're making.
Thank you for the clarity here. I see our Mai wants to add something, right?
Yes, please. I guess it's another aspect is that there's constraints on a lot of the approaches to CO2 removals that will limit which region you can deploy it. So for example, something that involves carbon capture and storage, you're very much constrained to regions of the world where there's geological storage sites that you can actually inject CO2. There's land availability constraints, and so certain regions might do better where certain technologies require a lot of land, and you should really be citing them based on where it's best to do a certain technology and not just kind of putting it anywhere, because certainly with biochar, you know, it's very much opportunist where you're looking where there's a feedstock that's very cheap. There's an agricultural sector, so you can apply the biochar in a near local region. Things like community agroforestry, there's certain parts of the world where they are very well suited for these approaches. And the same thing with, like, you know, carbon mineralization approaches where there's industry nearby. So then it makes sense to do a sort of like carbonated material type of technology because you're adjacent to infrastructure that has utilities and things that you can access. So that's really like where the regional aspect comes in. And so there's also biocide preference on region where they kind of want to support technologies that are being deployed in a certain region that their business does a lot of, you know, business with. So they might want to support that because, you know, we do a lot of business with the Asia region. So we want to look for Asia-based projects. So you definitely get preferences on the buyer side because of that sort of thinking.
I want to stay exactly in this geographical discussion. I will double down here. Question coming exactly from Asia, and this time is for you, Harper. So would you already do this alignment of offset procurement strategy with supply chain geography? In other words, you procure credits, you look at credits from the same jurisdictions where you have your sourcing.
Yeah, so I think it depends on how we're looking at it. So I think first, when we're looking at insetting or reductions, it's obviously within our supply chain. So within the exact regions, the exact farms, areas that we're sourcing from. And then when it goes to other credits, other areas, as we look at more renewable energy and electricity, and transparently, that's not my space within this, but that then we look at more at just a whole grid level. We're not saying, okay, it has to be renewable energy in Malaysia or something. We're looking at it at our overall footprint. If we're investing in renewable energy that then goes to the grid, we're less, kind of region agnostic about that area and do it where it's actually available. But for reduction, it's really within our supply chain.
Next question, again from the audience, this time comes from Kevin, is for you, Alexia. And I see that, first of all, you got some words of appreciation, and I can only agree with. But the question is, why not to take the capital that you are discussing and deploy it in solution now, for example, renewable energy? What would it be your perspective on these and versus other solution that takes year to prove out, other solution that are yet in a more uncertain phase?
Yeah, it's a great question and an important one. I think it gets to this sort of distinction we make between avoided emissions and removals, but also just taking that more blended strategic approach as we're thinking about an investment portfolio. Like, obviously, many companies, really, there's an enormous variation in the degree of risk tolerance and interest companies have in making direct investments in companies or in managed funds that have exposure to a broad range of either emission reduction projects themselves or new technology. So there's lots of different well-established pathways for deploying capital more directly into a wide range of emission reduction opportunities. A lot of companies are using investment tax credits to incentivize investment in renewable energy, for example, in the United States, which is driving a lot of the market. And so it really depends, I think, on the predilections of the particular company, its investment strategy, its risk tolerance, where it wants to have exposure, and the way in which it's thinking about meeting its overall kind of portfolio of approaches that are going to be required in order to help it deliver its internal decarbonization targets and goals alongside investment in emission reduction and removal technologies that are not directly tied to the supply chain. So there's no one easy answer on that one, but ideally, if we do a good job as we're in this moment of kind of redefining and rethinking what it means to put together a robust corporate net zero strategy, which now with the US election, unfortunately, is going to be even more important than ever. Voluntary action is going to continue to take the lead, particularly for US headquartered companies. And we really need to, I think, as the climate and environment community, come together to help provide that really strong mandate and benefit to companies for taking voluntary action, because they don't have to be doing this. There is no requirement for them to mitigate their emissions. And if we make it too hard and painful for them, they're just going to stop. And so a lot of the work that we need to do, I think, is to help companies demonstrate both the opportunities to reduce their operating expenses and costs through strategic investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency, while also helping them put together that broader portfolio that's going to enable them to make meaningful progress towards net zero goals over the longer term. So we have some work to do to get those rules clarified, I think. But we're making good progress, and I'm optimistic that we will collectively come together and really start to put together a policy package that makes sense for companies to get them continuing to do this hard work and put their money where their mouth is as we continue to progress down this net zero decarbonization journey.
Good luck for all this policy work that you're leading, Alexia. Next question, we go back to you, Mai, and this comes from Bernard. We discuss all the carbon solutions on the Supercritical platform. We discuss your scientific perspective. Yet the concern is the following. Too often, we only take into account consideration, environmental considerations. Can you explain us a bit more how can a company choose its own package of carbon, NBS and TBS, also taking into account the S and the G?
That's an interesting question. I guess it's always going to be ultimately the real goal of why we're doing this is for the environment. And I guess it's kind of thinking about your business. And I guess, as Alexia mentioned, it's voluntary as well. And so thinking about the other aspects of, the S, I'm guessing, is around the sustainability aspect, and then also governance and thinking about, whether this is something that's verified or MRV side of things. So often when you're buying a credit, there's a sort of quality branded associated with that carbon removal. And that's not just the sort of environmental side or the carbon removal side. It's also all these other aspects, which might be additionality. It might be whether that's located in a region where they've got policy that might be, making this common practice. Therefore, it's not a policy additional type of project. And so really looking at these projects and thinking about holistically on various facets of that sort of whether it's needed. And so it's delivery risks, as we've already touched on, it's the environmental impact side of things, but then it's also, other things like the MRV, is it's quantifiable in terms of the carbon removal, and are they setting in place like the right protocol in order to demonstrate not just the immediate impacts, but also long-term impacts. And then the last sort of key pieces, like thinking about that all holistically on sort of when you're looking at a project. And so that's where, with our platform, we kind of vet across these different metrics to make sure that it meets all these aspects. And then the last piece of the social impact side, the SDGs, are they actually evidencing it? Because it's very easy for projects to make claims, but then you have to actually back up those claims. And so we go out to those projects to make sure, like, where's your sort of evidence to show that, you're improving gender equality? And so that's a lot of work. And often it's a part of checking with due diligence to make sure you meet those S&G aspects of a project, not just the environmental aspect. And often with these projects, they won't be forthcoming with that information. And so you need a kind of third party to kind of come in to do the auditing or do the due diligence check. And in our case, like, we work closely with suppliers to make sure that we get all that evidence, and we do provide, pass fail ratings. So if a project doesn't meet any of those requirements on the S part or the G part, we will actually fail them. So we assess across every metric. There's 180 metrics we look at. If any of those metrics fail, it could be a social impact metric, it could be environmental impact metric, it will just fail as a whole because it just doesn't meet our quality criteria. So that is very important to look holistically and not just on the environmental impact side. And that's where transparency is needed, because I think the other issue with credit rating agencies is you just see a letter or some rating, but what's the detail behind that rating? What evidence have they provided? And that's often, I think, for buyers, it's very confusing, because you don't know just by looking at an overall score what the actual detail is and whether evidence is there.
Indeed, I heard it so often, the confusion around what are we purchasing when we're looking at climate solutions. Given that we only have 3 minutes for completing this wonderful discussion and still so many questions, I will ask 60 seconds each from our 4 amazing panelists. And so this will be like also the last message I want to give to our audience. And I start with you, Harper. And the question comes from Alexia Kelly, and she asks you, which consideration are you taking into account when choosing between insetting and offsetting? And feel free to complement it with anything else you want to share with us.
Yeah, sure. I'll be quick because we have 2 minutes. So in general, we know we have to do some offsetting in order to get to net zero. So it's always going to be a part of our strategy, but our focus first and foremost, and where we direct our resources, is how can we develop a strategy long-term in setting that reduces emissions so that we're not continually producing those emissions. So reducing first, and then recognizing that there is going to be a 20 to 30% that we still have to purchase through offsets that we then develop more of a procurement strategy for.
I also use this to say thank you, Harper, for your example and for having been with us. Second question for you, Yauben. And in this case, our audience is asking you, how do you actually procure the carbon projects that you choose? And feel free to complement it with any other message.
Yeah, thank you. I'll keep it brief too. We do work with a few different partners. We have an ecosystem of partners, including marketplace providers, to really try to get access to as much projects as we can consider as possible as we go through the various criteria as we had mentioned earlier, the durability, the accounting, the verification, and so forth of identifying the right projects to work with. We do see carbon removals as being essential to any dialogue around being one of the puzzle pieces of the solution to achieving a net zero economy, and one that needs to grow more. And I think one of the earlier panelists had also mentioned that the cost for technology-based solutions need to be more cost competitive, and we would certainly second that as well. In what we've seen, the burden of these costs are not just to corporates, it's also to individuals and economies in the society as well. And while the cost of inaction is extremely exorbitant, but the cost of action is also the price of $1,000 or higher per ton, I think that makes it extremely challenging for us to scale the solutions that we need to see be scaled. And so we're looking forward to seeing how this industry continues to grow, and we do feel excited that there are interesting innovations here from an R&D perspective that could really represent as part of the solution necessary for a net zero economy.
Thank you, Yaven, not only for this answer, but for everything, literally, in this discussion and beyond. For you, Mike, comes another technical question, I would say. This time it comes from Sajini, I hope I pronounced it correctly, from the Global Heat Reduction Registry. And Sajini is asking, can you elaborate a bit more when we discuss the voluntary carbon market, the balancing of immediate and long-term goals?
Yeah. So the balancing of immediate and long-term goals is, interestingly, you can sort of develop a strategy that looks at that. So there's, different types of projects that are delivering today removals because they're operational projects. So you can buy those to deliver on your immediate requirements. But long-term goals, you can start looking at projects that are looking for offtakes. And this is where you can start catalyzing and also creating scale for the future, where there are projects out there that look very promising, and it's just a matter of them getting offtakes essentially to deliver, to kind of demonstrate economic viability that then can make final investment decisions that then lead to the project actually happening. And so this is where you can kind of think in the long-term strategy, where are these projects lying and what looks the most promising, what can give impact to my business, what synergies are there to that project? And that's where you can kind of think about on your long-term goals, because long-term wise, you're just trying to secure that supply. And if you get in before sort of the final investment decision, you can potentially get a more sort of competitive price point, because often these projects are willing to kind of provide a lower price point when it's pre-FID.
Thank you, Mai, again, for all your insights and the support in organizing this webinar, and also for the beautiful conclusions you bring in your science and your research. Last question goes for our Alexia. And here I take the question from Simone, this time from Italy. And Simone is asking about the importance of field data. I know is more and more necessary. Luckily, is more and more available. So he wants to know from you how you've been establishing pipelines to get this data, and what's missing so far.
Yeah, thanks. This is tough to answer in 30 seconds, but I think the advent of digital and remote sensing solutions, artificial intelligence, and a range of other technological advancements that have come around in the last 5 years are truly changing the game in our ability to do robust MRV all over the world in real time in a variety of applications, including for nature. So we're very excited about those improvements. And just in closing, Antonio Gutierrez said, we need everything everywhere all at once, which is true. But I'll leave you with the words of the great Stacey Abrams, who said something somewhere soon. So as we collectively move forward on this net zero transition, I hope we're able to balance those objectives and continue to do the common sense things we know to deliver near-term abatement, while also building the longer-term pathways we know are necessary for new technologies and approaches. Thanks for having us. It's been a great discussion.
Thanks to you, Alexia, today and always. Is actually just for me the opportunity to conclude this great discussion. To say a big thank you to our partner at Supercritical for their role in the market and for supporting us in spreading knowledge and information on the world of carbon and its necessary solutions. Maybe from me personally, if I can draw a conclusion, I want to retain with me the key word of balancing the different needs of companies, needs of budgetary constraints versus the ambitions that bring us all here together. I retain the importance of understanding well the difference between nature-based solutions and tech-based solutions, because together they can represent the best pathway for a net zero strategy. We know in one case having better short-term impact, the case of NBS. In the other case, for tech-based solutions, having more durability, more scalability. And all together, we're here for the same mission. So thank you for listening. Thank you for this time together. And especially thank you to my Arthur, Alexia, and Yauven. Talk to you soon, and have a beautiful evening.